And even Putin himself, in his State of the Nation address, has mentioned the need to introduce changes to make the economy more resilient. If Russia's economy was completely immune to sanctions, he wouldn't be saying that, right?
And therefore, we need to accept that Russia, before this aggression in 2022, prepared a lot of tools, a lot of resources to being more resilient for this type of sanctions. They get some lessons learned from our moves after their inclusion of Crimea and occupation of Crimea and Donbass. So for them, the military operation been always connected with this moves to secure from outside sanctions. And this is also the factor we need to have in our minds when we are thinking about the long-term perspective of sanctions. But you also mentioned about states which are right now cooperating or still cooperating with Russians, and they are offering them resources and also place to be in there. I think this is the very important task for diplomacy. I think we cannot stay in our position that West is united and we are supporting Ukraine. We achieve some of our goals inside European Union. We see right now that there is a lot of other continents with other types of perspective on Russia, on their policy, and that's why it's so important to see sanctions as a very long-term, a very sophisticated road with a lot of work to do with our negotiators, and also with our politicians and diplomats around the world. So that's why it's important to still discuss with Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and also with Turkey, with other players in, for instance, South America. We cannot see that in black-white perspective. This is a task. This is the task also for the supporters of Ukrainian defending the posture against Russian aggression. Of course, we need to accept that not all states will accept our perspective on Russia, on the aggression and the no-imperial policy. But still, we have a lot of tools and we have a lot of skills to change their attitude to, for instance, build more neutral state, which can be useful for blocking Russian export or Russian actions in economy. So I'm maybe more pragmatic and more optimistic. Of course, we haven't had big success. We still are working on this path to strengthen our pressure on Russia and their economy.
So it is, once again, very much a process that will take quite a while. Still, obviously, one also needs to remember that if there are Western companies doing business in Russia, perhaps more pressure should be exerted on them. And now let us take a look at the second newsreel of the day, in which the question of what does it mean to fight for peace is going to be examined.
Those who lived through the peace movements of the 1980s, when activists campaigned for unilateral nuclear disarmament, may experience déjà vu. A petition has been signed by more than 250,000 Germans in 48 hours, calling on their government to broker urgent peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. It argues that since the Ukrainians cannot win a war against the world's biggest nuclear power, Berlin should lead an effort to pursue an armistice. The movers of this petition are openly encouraging Chancellor Scholz to return to the policies of Angela Merkel. Silvio Berlusconi, a declared friend of Vladimir Putin, has meanwhile said that it is Ukraine which is responsible for provoking this war because of its attempts to defend the Donbass. Nothing new under the sun. Even back in 1940, there were politicians in Churchill's cabinet urging him to negotiate rather than fight.
And of course, we need to make it clear, Germany is just an example. Just a few days ago, there was a major protest in the United States, which was on the surface at least, designed to ensure that there are peace talks in Ukraine. It was called Rage Against the War Machine, except they've chosen the wrong war machine, probably because they were raging against the Western so-called war machine, forgetting that the biggest culprit is Vladimir Putin, his war machine, committing war crimes in Ukraine. They just seemed not to notice. Jan Piekło, do you believe that this sort of thing that we're seeing right now is only going to get worse? Because unfortunately, there are plenty of people who are likely to see the sort of narrative, we are fighting for peace, we want to stop the war, and they will just jump the bandwagon. Except these peace movements are more than meets the eye.
Yes, the crusades and crusaders for peace. It reminds me very much my young years in communist Poland and the protests against the Vietnam War. And finally, these protests managed even to win in the United States itself. So it's the weapon which was used at that time by the Soviet Union. Today is used in almost similar form by Russia. And Germany, because of so-called feeling of guilt, because of the World War II, is probably the easiest ground for this kind of crusaders to come up and try to voice for peace on the earth. What means what is beneficial simply for Russia right now. So we can say that it is nihil novi. It's nothing new. It's like it was in the old days of the Cold War. So it's repeating in similar way today.
And you've mentioned a crucial thing. Right now, the sort of peace that these movements are actually advocating would be beneficial for Russia because it would have meant territorial concessions. Dr. Jacek Raubo, by way of a brief reminder, why is this sort of peace really not something that we should be going for? Why is it pretty much, or it would have been, if we decided to go for a prelude to another war, in fact?
Without doubt, Russia not reformed the approach to this no-imperial policy. If they will continue this operation against Ukraine, they will have also opportunity to continue some operation against other states. So I think this is the core of Putinism. This is the core of their state ideology, that they need to have enemy. They need to have this offensive measures against some sovereignty states around the world, so mostly in Europe. So I disagree with any types of hypothesis that we need to accept that Russia cannot lose this war. We need to create a sphere to negotiate with them and to accept some territorial changes when we think about the sovereignty of Ukraine. But I would like to emphasize one more thing. You talk about this type of struggles on the streets to save the peace or to strengthen the peace. We need to remember, and I mentioned today that thing before this question, that for Russians, this is a normal weapon against the West. In the Cold War, they arranged a lot of such moves in various states in Western Europe, and around the world. So they will use this type of active measures against our societies. And also, we need to be sure that Russia is regrouping their forces in info domain. So they will put a pressure on their soft power tools in also a group of states by activating pro-Russian politicians, by activating pro-Russian NGOs and groups which are, of course, not fully presenting as a Russian or pro-Russian groups, but they are, with their agenda, they are supporting this type of Russian policy. And I think this is a very stable form of Russian activity against the West, which is a continuity of Soviet Union type of policy. So we need to be prepared for that. We need to accept that democracy is open for any type of debate, any type of arguments. But at the same time, we need to strengthen our self-defense for disinformation, for these various types of active measures coming from Russian intelligence services. And I'm sure that a lot of Russian agents, Russian people covered by some illegal legend inside Western states are right now activated by Russian intelligence services to strengthen this type of so-called peace movements. And we need to accept and we need to fight with that.
Unfortunately, they are already active. I mean, look at Roger Waters. Theoretically, he is not pro-Russian, but effectively he is, through what he is doing. And he decided to speak for Russia at the United Nations session. So, very quickly now, Jan Piekło, do you think this is a war we can win? The information war, the war for hearts and minds on our own soil? We should, but isn't this, in fact, the most difficult thing of all?
It is not so difficult. So we have a group of so-called, maybe not fully pro-Russian, but these pacifists who are just right now trying to convince us, the Poles, that it is not our war. It is our war, and this message sent by Biden from Kiev is probably the best way to convince the people. We Poles, they do not need to be convinced. They understand.
Unfortunately, many citizens of Western countries still believe that this is a war that's taking place somewhere far away, somewhere that doesn't really concern them. And why is this the most difficult thing? Obviously, we have regulations concerning free speech, and we need to keep them because they define our societies. Meanwhile, if we tried to spread our word, our narratives in Russia, it's going to be shut down because Russia doesn't care about free speech, just like any dictatorship doesn't really care about this. So this is a difficulty, but obviously our societies need to create measures that will allow us to face this particular challenge. Jan Piekło, Jacek Rauba were our guests today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us. Just like President Joe Biden said, a year ago it seemed that Kyiv might fall within weeks. However, right now Kyiv still stands, and so does the hope for Ukraine to win the war. It is our responsibility as the collective West to make sure that this hope actually materializes and that Putin's delusional ambitions are cast into the dustbin of history. And that was all on this episode. I'm Ina Ślewiński, and this was Lost in Translation.
Hello and welcome to TVP World. You're watching another edition of Break the Fake, where we debunk fake news and examine false narratives. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and let's get rolling. The Kremlin held a day of silence for the victims of its imperialist ambitions. That's what we could call the absolute lack of any mainstream response to the one-year mark of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The sad anniversary was met with silence, of course, because Moscow failed to accomplish any of the goals it set last year, and its armies have been basically stalled since the last July. These breaks in public messaging are often taken advantage of by all sorts of D-listers. Small wonder, then, that we've been blessed by another screed from none other than Dmitry Medvedev. The brave court jester has recently taken to Telegram to announce that Russia will be winning this war and added that Moscow should push back the borders that threaten our country as far as possible, even if they are at the borders of Poland. Medvedev capped off his post with a retelling of the myth about Zeus turning into a bull to abduct the Princess Europa. According to the has-been statesman, today it's arrogant America playing the role of the bull, eagerly served by traitors of European interests such as Poland and the Baltic states. It seems, however, that despite all these angry pronouncements, the American bull has managed to strike fear into the highest ranks of the Kremlin's propaganda establishment.
У нас есть гегемон. Сейчас на планете Земля есть только один гегемон. Это Соединенные Штаты, которому Россия бросила вызов. Математически это полное безумие, все это прекрасно понимают. Как и всегда, Россию может спасти и спасет исключительно Господь Бог, а не математика. Ну, еще работать придется и воевать, конечно же, придется.
And if the propaganda mouthpieces are invoking God's mercy, then the self-styled Tsar must be beside himself. Yevgeny Savstanov, the former head of the Moscow FSB office, believes that Putin perfectly understands the mood of people who have lost everything because of him. The retired officer also said that Putin has no idea how to dig himself out of the hole he's found himself in and is grasping at every prospect of possible victory, no matter how small. Anton Gerashenko has recently posted a video featuring Vladimir Putin's address to the soldiers delivered on Russian Special Operations Forces Day.
Уважаемые товарищи, дорогие ветераны, поздравляю вас с профессиональным праздником, Днем сил специальных операций. Вас по праву считают гордостью российской армии. Всех бойцов и командиров сил специальных операций отличают высочайший уровень подготовки, умение и готовность действовать дерзко, решительно, молниеносно.
Ukrainian intelligence reports and the scraps of information leaking from the Kremlin suggest that the situation in the upper echelons of power in Russia is very tense, mostly due to the lack of significant victories of the front line. British defense analyst Michael Clark believes that Putin might soon be ousted by his inner circle, especially given the fact that Poland's first Leopard 2 tanks have made their way to Ukraine, and that was Kremlin's red line, crossing which was supposed to spell the destruction of the West. Well, it seems that both the Ukrainians and their friends are in high spirits and not exactly afraid of Russia's wrath.
Да, и сразу руку сюда. Оп, да, все, супер. Вот. Я так розумію, що там внизу оператор пояс, а водій це не з тої сторони. Ну да, і є. Машинвер 762 на 51. Скільки? От 100. О, ми зараз до нього підійдемо. Panie premierze, witam pana. Jest, mi podejść. Wstajemy? Tankowa koalicja. Tak, na różnych kierunkach. Można?
Drodzy żołnierze, przywieźliśmy z Polski pierwsze 4 leopardy po to, żebyście mogli jak najszybciej wygonić rosyjskiego agresora. Dziękuję za waszą odwagę, za waszą walkę.
Gdzie pierwsze wrażenie? Przepraszam, gdzie jest droga na Moskwę?
Wherever there's turmoil, sooner or later, Beijing appears. That's almost a given at this point. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has published a 12-point position paper about the war in Ukraine. The document, called a peace plan, mostly rehashes Beijing's existing stance on the Russian aggression. The first point calls for respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states, while the rest mostly appeal for an end to hostilities and a return to the negotiating table, while emphasizing the need to protect the civilian population and nuclear power stations. The Chinese plan also postulates the scrapping of sanctions against Russia and a pledge to abstain from using nuclear weapons. Now, Beijing is not interested in actually mediating the conflict. The goal here is to put up a diplomatic smokescreen to conceal the still close ties between Beijing and Moscow, all the while denouncing the US and NATO as fueling the conflict. This PR operation is not intended for Europe, but for the countries of the global south. Beijing's position ultimately situates itself within what's been called pro-Russian neutrality. Its so-called peace plan refrains from calling the Russian attack an invasion, all the while using language that supports the Kremlin's diplomatic position. Washington's concern over the deepening military ties between China and Russia have coincided with the visit of China's chief diplomat Wang Yi to Moscow. Welcoming the official, Vladimir Putin asserted that Chinese-Russian relations are reaching new milestones. The Kremlin autocrat is reportedly also planning a meeting with President Xi Jinping himself, but no specific dates have been disclosed. Sources only mention April or May as possible timeframes. What we do know is that Belarusian despot Alexander Lukashenko is heading to Beijing. Minsk might soon prove to be a key link in emerging military ties. On the one hand, Belarus is deeply enmeshed in defense projects with China and Russia. On the other, Minsk has years of experience in serving as a silent middleman in Russian arms exports, used as a go-between by countries that would prefer not to advertise their business links with Russian defense contractors. In the meantime, Lukashenko is doing his best to threaten his usual enemies, Poland and Lithuania.
Когда приехали поляки и литовцы к нам, посмотрели на нашу диктатуру и говорят, мы тоже хотим. А хотелки народа Литвы и Польши не совпадают с хотелками и действиями властей Польши и Литвы. Это главное. Но люди разберутся. Поляки же не дураки, это же такие люди, как мы. И литовцы тоже далеко не дураки. Разберутся. У них в ближайшее время тоже выборы за выборами. Вот посмотрим, как демократично они проведут их. Если они дадут людям проголосовать, народы их сметут.
Responding to China's so-called peace plan for Ukraine, President Biden's national security advisor Jake Sullivan said the proposal should have ended after the first bullet point, which calls for respecting the sovereignty of all countries. He also added that this war could end tomorrow if Russia stopped attacking Ukraine and withdraw its forces. Beijing's proposal also drew criticism from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who noted that the document did not stipulate the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. And with that, we conclude this edition of Break the Fake. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.
The German occupation of Poland in World War II was undoubtedly among the most brutal in human history. Each person murdered by the Germans was not only an unimaginable personal tragedy for the person's family, it was also an enormous loss for the Polish state. Social workers, teachers, and artists, no matter their profession, no matter their background, everyone was a target for the German invaders. Poland and other countries demanded compensation for its citizens from the German government. So far, to no avail.
Hello and welcome. Time for a news update on TVP World. It's 11 p.m. Central European Time. I'm Rafał Tomański. The European Union presented a diplomatic note to the Georgian government regarding former President Mikhail Saakashvili. The EU is concerned with his health and asked for his temporary release for treatment.
Former Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili is currently detained in Georgia. His health is reportedly worsening. This has led the European Union to ask for his temporary release so that he can receive treatment abroad. The EU ambassador to Georgia, Paweł Herczyński, handed a letter of protest to the Georgian government, asking for Saakashvili's transfer to Poland. Warsaw has backed the move. The current Georgian administration maintains good relations with Moscow, as opposed to Saakashvili during his tenure. The former president's arrest and detainment became a significant point of contention between Brussels and Tbilisi.
2023 marks the 9th year since Russia began its aggression against Ukraine. Ever since the start of the full-scale invasion, many have been wondering how long this conflict can go on. Our correspondent Don Arlet is in Kharkiv and has this report.
Russia may be changing its strategy and how it fights the war here in Ukraine. That's according to the latest British intelligence assessment, which says that over the past few weeks, Russia has been seeking to prolong this war as long as possible in order to exhaust Ukrainian resources and tire Ukrainian fighters, as well as exhaust Western support of the country, both financially and militarily. Also, this British assessment says that Russia is no longer seeking to gain ground, but to hold what it already has. Now, if we look at the another intelligence assessment that came out of Kiev today, according to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia still seeks to target civilian infrastructure, especially critical infrastructure such as electricity and, of course, fuel supply. With the amount of generators that has been employed in the country over the last several weeks and months, taking out fuel is also a top priority of Russia. Then there's also the Chinese peace plan, which is a 12-point strategy. Ukraine has said that it likes some of the points, but what makes it pretty much a non-starter here in Ukraine is the fact that it does not recognize, or at least doesn't have a provision that recognizes the borders that were established back in 1991 when the Soviet Union was broken up. Ukraine obviously will not accept any territorial gains by Russia, including Crimea and the Donbass region, as well as Zaporizhia and what is left of Kherson region. Russia said earlier today that it is still interested in such a deal. Any deal that would bring peace seems to be attractive for Russians. However, with the big difference in opinions on whether to recognize or not recognize those territorial gains that Russia claims to have made, is definitely the sticking point of the Chinese peace plan. And also, the United States has watered down the idea that the plan would actually be employed. Don Arleth, reporting from Kharkiv, TVP World.
Monday, February 27, marks the 8th anniversary of the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. The former Russian deputy prime minister and later opposition leader was murdered just steps away from Kremlin. And here is our report.
Supporters of prominent Russian opposition figure Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated 8 years ago near the Kremlin, laid flowers at the site of his murder. Nemtsov, who was 55 and one of President Vladimir Putin's most vocal critics, was murdered in 2015 as he walked across a bridge near the Kremlin after dining with his girlfriend. In July 2017, a Russian court sentenced a man convicted of murdering Nemtsov to 20 years in jail and handed terms of between 11 and 19 years to 4 other men convicted of being his accomplices. The same court found the 5 men guilty of killing Nemtsov, but the late politician's allies said the investigation had been a cover-up and that the people who had ordered his killing remained at large.
Prosecutor in Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's trial in absentia has demanded a 19-year sentence for the opposition leader. The exiled politician has called the trial a sham and added that the prosecution's request only gives her extra motivation.
Almost each week brings a new political trial in Belarus. The dictatorship is trying to stamp out every sign of opposition. Not everyone is kept in a cage during their trial, though. Some have managed to flee the country before they could be detained. The trial of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is being conducted in absentia.
It has nothing to do with justice. It is just personal revenge against me and others who are opposing the regime. It will only make us fight even harder.
A regime prosecutor has also asked for a 19-year sentence for another significant opposition figure, Pavel Latushka. Latushka has recently decided to leave the Cooperation Council, a movement associated with Tikhanovskaya, over a difference of opinions.
The criminal case is being considered by the regime's court for activities in the Coordination Council and the Democratic Forces of Belarus. It motivates me to keep fighting.
According to Human Rights Center Vyazna, there are currently around 1,500 political prisoners in Belarus. The large-scale repressions in the country began after the presidential elections in 2020. The results of which are widely believed to be falsified. The United States, as well as the European Union and many other Western countries, did not recognize the outcome of the vote.
Belarusian dissidents claim to have blown up a Russian military aircraft based outside of Minsk. This would mark the first armed action from anti-government activists in Belarus to date.
In the early hours of last Sunday, a Russian aircraft stationed at a Belarusian airbase outside Minsk found itself the target of an attack. The Belarusian group BIPOL, composed of former state security and law enforcement officers, claimed responsibility for the action.
The attack was carried out by Belarusian partisans, participants in the Victory Plan. Drones were really used. There were 2 explosions. One hit the aircraft's dish, while the other one was in the fuselage area. The aircraft was severely damaged.
The target of the attack was a Beriev A-50, a Russian airborne warning and control aircraft. Fitted with a large radar, the A-50 is tasked with airspace control and surveillance. Russia owns only a handful of these platforms, and likely less than 10 are operational. The loss of even one will significantly affect Moscow's air operations.
In general, this aircraft was used by the Russians on the territory of Belarus to conduct reconnaissance in Ukraine for the purpose of directing missile strikes. Whenever it took off, it was usually followed by aircraft carrying Kinjal missiles, and soon air raid alerts would be sounded across Ukraine.
Some Russian commentators say that the attack was conducted by Ukraine using long-range drones, but BIPOL denies this.
If these were not Belarusian partisans, we would not have claimed responsibility. Then there's the question of Belarusian air defense, which would have to somehow miss the drones allegedly flying in from the Chernihiv region, crossing much of Belarusian territory, and then finally arriving to strike in Machulishchi.
Officials in Minsk have not released any statements or comments on the incident. The raid would mark the first time Belarusian dissidents conducted an armed attack inside the country's borders.
62 migrants, including a few-month-old infant, died after their overloaded boat sank in stormy seas of Italy's southern coast on Sunday. Search and rescue operations are underway, and here is more.
Residents of Crotone gathered on Monday to pay tribute to the victims of the tragedy which took place at sea, not far away from this small Italian town. Locals laid flowers outside the Palamilon Sports Hall where the bodies were being kept.
There is this reason, which I do not think is irresponsibility, when you have to feed your children and think of a future. Who among us can tell a person you have to die in the midst of the war, in the midst of political instability, in the midst of poverty and hunger? You have to think that in everyone's heart there is a prospect for the future.
As of Monday afternoon, 61 bodies have been recovered, including 12 children. The small wooden ship crashed against rocks off the eastern coast of Calabria, sailing from Turkey. According to the Italian authorities, there could have been up to 200 people on board, coming from Afghanistan, Iran, and other countries in the Middle East.
And now some bad news for travelers. More than 300 flights at Germany's regional airports have been grounded due to yet another strike by disgruntled employees.
It is the latest chapter in a series of strikes that have affected the country. Verdi Trade Union, Germany's second-largest union by membership, announced a strike on Friday as it failed to reach an agreement with employees.
If the employers continue to refuse to come up with a proposal, the workers' reaction will be clear. We will respond with a strike, which is not what we want, but if the employers don't cooperate.
The dispute in the German sector over pay and conditions continues. Earlier this month, 7 other German airports were on strike, including the Frankfurt and Munich hubs, affecting nearly 300,000 passengers.
The U.S. state of Oklahoma has been ravaged by tornadoes. 12 people were injured in the incident. Tornadoes went through the U.S. state of Oklahoma on Sunday night, caused significant damage to a number of houses. The capital of the state, Oklahoma City, was especially badly affected. The winds reached up to 160 kilometers per hour. The city is located in an area frequently affected by this weather phenomena, known as Tornado Alley. 4 people were charged with murder of a model from Hong Kong. Her body was dismembered and several parts of it are still missing. Some viewers may find the following content disturbing.
This suburban house is where parts of the woman's body were found, along with the murder weapons. Some of the human remains were found inside a large pot.
The liquid was up to the top of the pot. There was a lot of fat solidified in the form of jelly at the top, and there were also lots of scraps of soup. I remember carrots and green radishes, and there was also minced meat, which I believe were human remains.
The disturbing murder scene was uncovered 2 days after police started searching for the missing model. Her ex-husband and his immediate family, brother and father, were charged with the woman's murder. This is one of the last photographs of the model and influencer Abi Choi taken before the murder. The search for her missing body parts continues.
SpaceX and NASA have postponed the launch of the Crew 6 mission to the International Space Station. The mission includes crew members from all over the world, 2 NASA astronauts, a Russian cosmonaut, and an astronaut from the United Arab Emirates. The SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket and Crew Dragon were supposed to take off from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, at 7:45 EST today. SpaceX cited a technical glitch concerning the ignition fluid used to start the spacecraft's engines as the reason for postponing today's launch. The first backup launch opportunity for the mission is set for early Tuesday, about 24 hours from the initial launch attempt. Aurora Borealis, also known as Northern Lights, was observed in Denmark. The phenomena is usually observed in the polar regions and is rarely seen as far south. And that's all for now. More news as always on the top of the hour. In the meantime, stay with us for more on TVP World.
Welcome to Middle East Observer with me, Nicholas Richardson. And this week we look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan bin Saud has visited Brussels and Munich. At meetings with European politicians, the world of business and the military, the Saudi Foreign Minister discussed issues related to energy, the war in Ukraine, the kingdom's relations with Russia and threats from Iran. He confirmed that Saudi Arabia would join the nuclear race if Iran becomes a nuclear power, and noted that Riyadh was in favour of compromise solutions to both the war in Ukraine and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Bin Farhan also emphasised that Riyadh is a stabiliser of the crisis-ridden Middle East and Africa, and he also encouraged EU countries to cooperate more broadly in the region. According to some media, Bin Farhan's visit shows the political return of Saudi Arabia to the European orbit. With this return, given Riyadh's regional leadership, Saudi Arabia would like to counter its difficult relations with the United States with rather better ones with the European Union. In exchange for developing a political solution to the Iranian issue, it would hope to strengthen cooperation with Europe. And to discuss this in more detail, I'm delighted to be joined once more by Salman Al-Ansar, a Saudi political analyst. Salman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for having me again.
A pleasure. And before we sort of wade in to talk about Saudi relations with Europe, I wonder how the visit of President Biden to Ukraine and Poland has been perceived in Saudi and maybe in the wider Arab world.
Yeah, I think nothing has changed. I think the Saudi public opinion hasn't changed as of yet. And the Russian invasion and taking territories by force is a big no for the Saudis and for the Arabs, because it goes against the international accords and all the treaties we have known since the inception of the United Nations. So there's no a big kind of shift in the way of the narrative the Saudis and the Arabs have with regards to what's going on between Russia and Ukraine or between Russia and NATO. But when it comes to Biden's visits to the region, yes, it actually somehow signaled that the war will still escalate. There's no much talk about having a peaceful resolution. There's no much talk about having a discussion with the conflicting parties. So that's one of the reasons that we kind of have concerns, because guess what, Nicholas? Nobody is talking about having or launching a big peace conference. No one, neither Russia nor the NATO or the US. So that in itself is very alarming, specifically after we've seen at President Putin's speech when he talked about like not having the treaty of the nuclear, etc. And that's in itself is a big escalation. And we are just worried that only thing that will happen in the future is just escalate to de-escalate, but what we are seeing is escalate to escalate. So that in itself is very alarming, and we hope we hope that like very soon things will just calm down and the two conflicting parties get to the negotiating table so they can resolve their differences.
Indeed. Now, the Saudi foreign minister has recently been in Brussels and also attended the security conference in Munich. Some commentators have sort of suggested this might be some sort of Saudi comeback tour, which is probably slightly over-dramatising it. But I was wondering if you could just summarise from Saudi's point of view, what are Saudi's main interests in the European Union?
Great. Honestly, like I don't think Saudi Arabia is coming back to Europe. It's mostly Europe coming back to Saudi Arabia. And that has been proven by the words of the EU High Representative Joseph Borrell on May last year. He talked about the importance of elevating the cooperation between the GCC nations and the EU. So that has been seen with very positive light from all the GCC nations, including Saudi Arabia. So definitely, when it comes to EU-Saudi relations, they have been historic. It has been there for more than half a century, and we would love to develop and enhance this relationship and take it to another level. And I don't want to exaggerate, but I really believe that the next decade, EU-Saudi relations will witness their golden era, Maybe that sounds hyperbolic, but in reality, that's what we are seeing, because the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia right now is transitioning from fossil fuel to clean energy as well, and they are becoming the leader and the capital of clean energy in the whole world, specifically in the field of green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, which I'm still struggling to understand, but but it's one of the things that I think that will strengthen the EU-Saudi relationships. And let's not forget what the Saudis has done with Greece, and they have actually had a big partnership project with Greece, so they can have Greece to be the energy center for all Europe. So most of the energy that will come from Saudi Arabia, the clean one, the hydrogen, etc., also the gas, will go through Greece to all Europe. So we are seeing a big momentum with regards to the EU-Saudi relationship, and there are a lot to participate in, but definitely what we want from the EU is to take into considerations the security challenges that we are facing in the Middle East by the Islamist and by the terrorist and also by the radical Iranian regime. So we definitely need more decisiveness from the EU with regards to Iran. So yeah.
Yeah. Now, interestingly, of course, you just touched on hydrocarbons, and of course, Poland has increasingly been working with Saudi suppliers of hydrocarbons and Saudi Aramco, whereas in contrast, for example, Germany has, hitherto at least, always looked for Russia to supply its hydrocarbon needs. I was wondering if you saw any prospect in the future of Germany, which obviously is having to turn away from Russia, in any way turning towards Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely. I think the Germans have somehow succeeded. We should applaud them for succeeding to mitigate the energy security issue after the war and after they have had this complete shutdown with the Russian gas and oil. But at the same time, definitely they will be facing more challenges in the future, because you cannot have a competitive economy without having reasonable energy prices. So I think Saudi Arabia will definitely step in, and OPEC at large. And if we look at the Saudi-German relationship, it has always been a good relationship. It started in 1977, or it got solidified in 1977, and Saudi Arabia to Germany is considered to be the second most important Arab trading partner, and Berlin is the fourth largest supplier for the kingdom in 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And also during the pandemic, Saudi oil exports to Germany amounted to about $108 million and $430 million in non-oil exports. So relations are growing rapidly, especially in economic aspects. So yeah.
That's good. Now, Germany, of course, has been one of the more critical or more outspoken critics of the Saudi crown prince. And at the same time, the perception is that Germany has given Tehran a rather easier ride when it comes to things like human rights and related matters. And I was wondering, from the Saudi perspective, how the relationship between Germany and other European countries with Iran affects the relationship or the potential relationship those countries enjoy with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I think the beautiful thing about your question is that it's self-explanatory, in the sense that there is this definitely a double standards when it comes to approaching the Middle East, where you see the Crown Prince to be criticized for things that have not been happening with regards to human rights, etc. And we are witnessing in Saudi Arabia right now, we are having the biggest reforms, like packages of reforms when it comes to social and economic reforms. So, and we haven't witnessed that for the last 50 years. So, but at the same time, with regards to Iran, yes, it is very concerning seeing Germany and other EU countries, but specifically Germany, having some kind of a special kind of relationship with Iran that no one can understand. But at the same time, we've seen them to shift their policies once they have realized that Iran is actually supplying the Russian army with the drones. So we've been saying this to the world, that the Iranians are actually firing missiles and ballistic missiles towards Saudi Arabia. They've been doing this through their proxy, the Houthi militia, and they have been throwing drones, etc., explosive ones. And nobody in Germany or any other EU nations took it seriously. But once they have heard and seen the reports about them supplying Russia with drones, then things change. So right now we are seeing actually a momentum against Hezbollah terrorist militia. We are seeing the momentum in Germany. It has happened, I think, 2 years ago that they have put some sanctions, and they sanctioned the group completely, and they didn't allow them to work on the German lands, which I'm right now in Berlin. And and also we all know about the criticisms that happens against the kingdom always had something to do with Iranian narratives or Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood, or from rogue regimes. So these campaigns are directed by organizations that want nothing but to break the alliance between Saudi Arabia and its major allies, specifically the United States and the EU.
Yes. Now, I wonder, because we can't ignore it, of course, the terrible earthquake last week in Turkey and Syria. And I wonder if you could just say, well, it's really a two-part question, if you could just say a few words about the Saudi Arabian aid to Syria, and then slightly developing that theme, do you see this as Syria likely to sort of be more open to the world? But can Syria be more open to the world if Iran is such a dominant force in influencing the Syrian president?
Yeah, I think it's a very tough question, and I seriously do not have an answer for. But what I can say with regard to the humanitarian aspect, Saudi Arabia, I'm glad to say that Saudi Arabia, according to the UN, based on GNI, Saudi Arabia is considered to be the largest donor of humanitarian assistance in the world, with more than $85 billion. And with regards to Syria, definitely Saudi Arabia was one of the first countries to go and aid the people who have been affected by the earthquake, which was a very, very sad incident. But with regards to Saudi-Syrian rapprochement or normalization, I think it has been hinted by the Foreign Affairs Minister of Saudi Arabia, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, at the Munich Security Conference. He talked for the first time about a possible negotiation or a possible way through which they can open up with Damascus, with the Bashar regime. But he highlighted the reasons behind that opening, even though the opening didn't happen yet. Among the reasons were the things that are related to refugees, the Syrian refugees who are specifically in Jordan and Lebanon. And they have been affecting definitely the economies of these vulnerable countries. So Saudi Arabia would love to have a comprehensive view of the region, because it's not in the interest of Saudi Arabia to have their neighbors to be struggling economically or security-wise. So definitely Saudi Arabia would love to see some kind of positive attitude from the other players in the region, specifically Syria. But he emphasized that there is no strategy as of yet. There's no strategy of how to formulate a formula through which they can get the Syrian regime back to the Arab fold. Okay,
well look, Salman, always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts on Saudi Arabia and the region as a whole. Always well worth listening to. Alas, that's all we've got time for on this edition, but I hope you'll join us again in the future.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Well, there we have it. Another very interesting canter through the course with Salman. Always an interesting chap to talk to. Alas, as I said, the clock has defeated us this time. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. And we look forward to seeing you next time on Middle East Observer. Thank you for watching.
Coffins laid out near the beach on the coast of Italy serve as a grim symbol of the ongoing migrant crisis. Italian authorities discovered yet another body following a migrant shipwreck on Sunday. Authorities believe 180 to 200 people were on board the ship, carrying migrants from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Syria.
They are aware not only that they are risking their lives, but that they are embarking with traffickers. They arrive with their life savings to make the crossing.
Italy is located along the popular Central Mediterranean migratory route, which is one of the most used paths to Europe. The country serves as a gateway into the European Union, but has ramped up efforts to decrease the amount of irregular migration into the country. Unfortunately, this makes little to no difference.
We keep hearing, I would rather die at sea than go back to Libya. So rules like this will never stop people from making that crossing. People on the run will not stop trying to find safety.
This migratory route has seen a record 100,000 crossings in the past year, but also over 20,000 deaths and disappearances since 2016. The Central Mediterranean route has been dubbed as the most dangerous crossing in the world.
Dozens of deaths, including children. The Five-Star Movement has been asking for years a management of migration flows shared with Europe. Continuing to wait is proving inhumane.
Italy is one of the so-called countries of first entry, bearing a great burden in protecting European borders. The country's authorities have long called for a framework of greater cooperation in managing the unprecedented flow of migrants into the bloc.
Until last year, anti-Kremlin Russian activists took to the streets every year to honor the memory of murdered opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. Though the event draws significantly smaller crowd nowadays, many people still commemorate his death.
Boris Nemtsov could have become the best president of our country out of anyone I know, but there are no people like him anymore.
The staunch critic of Putin's regime was killed with 4 shots to back late on the evening of February 27, 2015, on the Great Moscow Bridge near the Kremlin.
He was a leader of the democratic movement, a hero of our time.
Nemtsov's family and supporters say the likely perpetrators of the murder have been brought to justice, but those who ordered the killing were never punished. A final indictment was brought against 4 suspects in July 2017. A Moscow court quickly sentenced Zaur Dadayev to 20 years in a penal colony. Investigators claimed it was Dadayev who fired shots at Nemtsov. The court hearing itself took only half an hour. The investigation was hasty and many clues were left out.
The only person who really wanted his death the most is in Kremlin now. So this case could not be investigated at all.
Nemtsov was a vocal critic of Moscow's annexation of the Crimea and predicted that Russia would soon attempt to continue its offensive into Ukraine. He was shot just days after announcing that he had prepared a report showcasing Moscow's plans for the attack. Any attempts to commemorate Nemtsov's memory have been brutally suppressed by the Kremlin.
Nigeria's elections have been marred by delays, irregularities, and incidents of violence. In Lagos, 15 men pretending to be electoral officials broke into a voting collation center and attacked Labour Party agents with knives and clubs. Despite the incident, wildcard presidential hopeful Peter Obi of the Labour Party managed to secure a victory in Nigeria's commercial hub on Monday, but he may not be victorious.
Bola Tinubu, running on the ticket of the incumbent ruling party, is probably would probably win.
According to provisional results announced by electoral officials in 10 of Nigeria's 36 states, Bola Tinubu from the governing All Progressive Congress Party leads with about 3.29 million votes against 2.28 million for Atiku Abubakar of the main opposition People's Democratic Party and 818 for Obi. But despite the winner of the presidential race, little to no change in Nigeria's foreign policy is to be expected.
Nigeria is one of the most Western-oriented countries of the region, so that would continue. There is a strong pro-European and pro-American, like pro-Atlantic, we may say so, vector of the foreign policy. If West Africa is very much penetrated by Russia
particularly in French-speaking countries. Nigeria is not with them.
To win the presidential election, a candidate needs a simple majority, provided they have garnered at least a quarter of the votes cast in at least 24 states. Should no candidate achieve that, a runoff will be held within 21 days.
In the early hours of last Sunday, a Russian aircraft stationed at a Belarusian airbase outside Minsk found itself the target of an attack. The Belarusian group BIPOL, composed of former state security and law enforcement officers, claimed responsibility for the action.
The attack was carried out by Belarusian participants in the victory plan. Drones were really used. There were 2 explosions. One hit the aircraft's dish, while the other one was in the fuselage area. The aircraft was severely damaged.
The target of the attack was a Beriev A-50, a Russian airborne warning and control aircraft. Fitted with a large radar, the A-50 is tasked with airspace control and surveillance. Russia owns only a handful of these platforms, and likely less than 10 are operational. The loss of even one will significantly affect Moscow's air operations.
In general, this aircraft was used by the Russians on the territory of Belarus to conduct reconnaissance in Ukraine for the purpose of directing missile strikes. Whenever it took off, it was usually followed by aircraft carrying Kinjal missiles, and soon air raid alerts would be sounded across Ukraine.
Some Russian commentators say that the attack was conducted by Ukraine using long-range drones, but BIPOL denies this.
If these were not Belarusian partisans, we would not have claimed responsibility. Then there's the question of Belarusian air defense, which would have to somehow miss the drones allegedly flying in from the Chernihiv region, crossing much of Belarusian territory, and then finally arriving to strike in Machulishchi.
Officials in Minsk have not released any statements or comments on the incident. The raid would mark the first time Belarusian dissidents conducted an armed attack inside the country's borders.
Russia may be changing its strategy and how it fights the war here in Ukraine. That's according to the latest British intelligence assessment, which says that over the past few weeks, Russia has been seeking to prolong this war as long as possible in order to exhaust Ukrainian resources and tire Ukrainian fighters, as well as exhaust Western support of the country, both financially and militarily. Also, this British assessment says that Russia is no longer seeking to gain ground, but to hold what it already has. Now, if we look at another intelligence assessment that came out of Kiev today, according to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia still seeks to target civilian infrastructure, especially critical infrastructure such as electricity and, of course, fuel supply. With the amount of generators that has been employed in the country over the last several weeks and months, taking out fuel is also a top priority of Russia. Then there's also the Chinese peace plan, which is a 12-point strategy. Ukraine has said that it likes some of the points, but what makes it pretty much a non-starter here in Ukraine is the fact that it does not recognize, or at least doesn't have a provision that recognizes the borders that were established back in 1991 when the Soviet Union was broken up. Ukraine obviously will not accept any territorial gains by Russia, including Crimea and the Donbass region, as well as Zaporizhia and what is left of Kherson region. Russia said earlier today that it is still interested in such a deal. Any deal that would bring peace seems to be attractive for Russians. However, with the big difference in opinions on whether to recognize or not recognize those territorial gains that Russia claims to have made, is definitely the sticking point of the Chinese peace plan. And also, the United States has watered down the idea that the plan would actually be employed. Don Arleth reporting from Kharkiv, TVP World.
Hello and welcome to TVP World. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, various sanctions have been imposed on Russia and its ally Belarus. How effective are these? To discuss this topic, I am joined here today by Sharunas Czerniauskas, a journalist from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Hello and welcome, sir. I'm delighted to have you with us.
Hello.
So, you just published a new journalistic investigation called Nasha Trasha. What does it mean and what does it include?
Oh, basically, it's a pun or a play of words mocking the popular Russian comedy show Nasha Russia. And Trasha in Lithuanian is fertilizer. Basically, what we uncovered was a way to bypass sanctions on one of the largest fertilizer manufacturers in Belarus, Grodno Azot. It happens to be the only fertilizer of urea in Belarus, and in spite of getting sanctioned, the product, the urea from Belarus, kept on flowing through Lithuania, and especially through the port of Klaipėda. And we uncovered basically two ways of how the sanctions were bypassed. One way was through the border in trucks, and the other way was heavily, the heaviest load, I guess, in trains. And that means thousands of tons of urea crossing Lithuania without raising any red flags.
Well, that is definitely something worth paying attention to. And I mean, is this a single case, or do you think there are more such cases? And sort of you probably looked at other examples too. And what can be done to make sanctions more effective?
Well, in this particular case, we uncovered two unrelated groups of people that were doing the same thing, basically. And according to our local politicians who commented on the story after we aired, it's basically a gaping hole in the European sanctions. Because Grodno Azot itself is under sanctions, but urea, the thing it produces, is not. So all they needed to do is invent some new manufacturers of the same product in Belarus, label the paperwork with those companies that aren't sanctioned, and then the alarms didn't go off. But now the Lithuanian government is trying to raise the alarm and demanding the EU to take action against Belarusian urea as well. And that would at least partially seal the gap. But of course, this is not the only way to bypass sanctions. Far from that.
Right. So, as you said, the Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs is saying that EU should appoint a European Commissioner responsible for sanctions. Right. So, sort of create a new post to deal with this specifically. What else could be done to strengthen, the mechanisms which govern this process?
Actually, both the Lithuanian MFA and the Ministry of Transportation are doing a joint call for a new European institution in charge of sanctions. It wouldn't be, just the new European Commissioner that would be in charge of sanctions, which would be basically a political post and talking head on the TV, but a separate institution in charge of implementing sanctions across the EU. That is something that journalists and activists have been speaking about for a very long time, because the EU needs that. Let's take the US for an example. There's OFAC, which is a separate institution in charge of implementing sanctions across the US, and it's extremely efficient. The EU doesn't have that. So we don't have a single institution, we don't have a single policy. And actually, every EU member state is free to interpret the sanctions the way it wants. So we have bizarre situations when the same companies and the same people are having their assets frozen in one or two EU member states, but in several other states, those assets are untouched.
Right. So, as you said, a central unit that would monitor and make sure that the sanctions are not bypassed. But if we could take a step back and take a look at what sanctions have been imposed so far on Russian and Belarusian entities and companies, right? Because we're also talking about individuals, and how they go about evading this. Is there a pattern, for instance?
We've noticed at least one pattern. The usual pattern when it comes to international trade, getting things from those two countries into the EU that weren't supposed to cross the border. The usual pattern is relabeling the origin. In this particular case, all that was needed was a new supplier company in place. But we've also noticed patterns of relabeling the country of origin. We know Central Asian countries are being used a lot for that. We have also signs coming that Turkey is also a major new destination of especially Russian goods arriving to the EU.
Right. Okay. What about individuals then? Because I think that a different process would govern their assets and what they do with them and how they're trying to hide it and all this.
High net value individuals, that's a different story, because they usually don't have things listed under their name, a flat in Paris or a yacht in Monaco. It's not usually listed under some wealthy guy from Russia. It's usually listed under an offshore company. And we've got European offshore jurisdictions like Cyprus or Malta. We've got international jurisdictions, let's say Panama, Belize, the British Virgin Islands, all the classics. And that's a tough thing to trace. And that's another thing that makes me remember the things we kept repeating for decades. We need more transparency, we need more openness, more beneficial ownership disclosure across the EU and across the world. Because the increased level of transparency is the thing that they fear the most. If journalists, activists, and the authorities have easy access to beneficial ownership information, it becomes much, much harder to hide assets. Now, I have reason to believe that billions of euros in assets are still freely laying right there across the EU and unnoticed, just because of the level of secrecy supplied by the offshore industry. And also the very same industry can be used to move money that shouldn't be moving in the European financial system. Still, that's a thing we need to tackle. We've made improvements over the decades, but still we're leaving too many gaps.
Right, but following, for instance, things such as, the infamous Panama Papers, right, and things that, such things that happened. So has there been an improvement to transparency, or because one would think so, right? I mean, since we've managed to find out once, it's probably something that could be repeated, right? So if I was a high net worth individual, I would be worried. That's what I'm saying.
Yes, there were several major improvements, and it's not only about the Panama Papers. We've had other leaks and multiple cases of offshore companies being used for money laundering. And this served as the reason to increase transparency across Europe, and it was a process that took at least a decade. I think it was more than a decade to establish beneficial ownership registries across the EU. But what took journalists and activists a decade took roughly a year for the other party to take measures against. We have the infamous ruling of the European Court that led to shutting down several of those registries immediately. And that's a very illustrative thing, just look at this. One lawsuit ruins a decade worth of work for transparency. And unfortunately, the other side has much more money and much more resources to make all kinds of efforts to undermine increasing transparency across Europe and across the world. And that's something that has to be battled.
Right, but on the other hand, hiding assets, right, is never beneficial for states, right? I mean, because it's often connected to tax evasion. So why would entities such as, sort of legal entities in Europe, for instance, want to sort of be on the wrong side of things?
There are several reasons. One of the reasons is the financial industry. Because even though things can be related to tax evasion, corruption, drug dealing, human trafficking, you name it, it makes money for the people that help make money. So the finance industry, in spite of also several improvements it made, is still very vulnerable to major money flows connected to organized crime and corruption. And also, unfortunately, I must say that some of this money inevitably lands within the EU economies. We have entire economies largely dependent on suspicious Russian money. Let's take Cyprus for an example. And that dependency inevitably leads to corruption. We can see how that money corrupted entire countries, and that's something that cannot be repeated.
Right, and do you think that sanctions, I mean, imposing sanctions and then sort of adhering to sanctions can harm economies of individual states? You've mentioned Cyprus. Are there any other examples of places that could potentially, on the surface be against, actually be imposing sanctions against Russia, but then perhaps doing something completely different, So if you could perhaps look into this.
Well, actually, within days after the war began, we saw Cyprus acting openly against some of the sanctions. So that's no secret. I mean, if you pulled out Russian money from Cyprus, it would probably lead to the total collapse of the country's economy. And that's the sad truth. And it's not only Cyprus. We have, the dependent financial industries like Cyprus, like Malta. We have the dependent energy industries. Whatever country has major supply or major dependency on Russian gas is in trouble since February 24th, 2022. And we see Germany as an example. So both money and resources can be used as political leverage, and that's what they do. I don't think there's any more need to present evidence that Russia can use pretty much anything to exercise pressure on particular countries or even particular politicians.
Okay, so in one sentence, what can we do to make sanctions more effective? Is it just sort of creating this special entity within the sort of European legal system, or is there something else?
Personally, I think it's about coordination and about human resources, because not only Lithuania, multiple EU member states do not have enough human capacity to impose sanctions in full scale. So we need more people, more qualified experts working in every country. We need more coordination within the EU member states and especially across EU, because when a sanction breach appears in one country, it will definitely be repeated in multiple EU member states. So if we know what's happening, if we exchange information, other EU member states have the time to react and to actually stop it.
Right, absolutely. That was very informative. Thank you so much for being with us and for your insights. So fingers crossed, things will improve. And thank you for watching TVP World. Please stay tuned for more of the latest news and features.
The discussion was surrounded by a high-stakes diplomatic furore. At last, Europe is set to supply Ukraine with Leopard 2 tanks. Sending the tanks will give Kyiv's forces a modern and powerful military archive ahead of a potential Russian spring offensive. The mainstay of Ukraine's tank fleet, is the Soviet-era T-72. Weighing in at 41 tons and with a top speed of 60 kilometers per hour, the T-72s are both lighter and slower than their NATO counterparts. The German-made Leopard 2 is easier to maintain and uses less fuel than some Western alternatives. It has 1,500 horsepower, advanced composite armor, a top speed of 70 kilometers per hour, a combat weight of nearly 55 tons. It has an operating range of 550 kilometers and a much faster rate of fire than many of its Russian opponents. Ukraine currently employs its fleet in indirect fire support. To take full advantage of the Leopard 2, Kyiv would have to evolve a new strategy for offensive tank-on-tank warfare. The strength of the Western tanks lies in sheer numbers. Ukraine will have to operate and sustain at least one armoured brigade to have a significant impact on the conflict. The plan is to deliver up to 100 tanks, which will allow the Ukrainian forces to form just such a unit. Fortunately, these are not the only armoured vehicles on the way. The US has approved the shipment of 31 of its Abrams tanks, and the UK will also provide 14 Challenger 2s.
Hello, this is Maciej Mikos welcoming you to the midnight edition of World News. Now let's take a look at tonight's headlines. After prolonged negotiations, the UK and the European Union have signed a post-Brexit agreement. And week-long legislative elections have begun in Estonia. Thousands of teddy bears tossed onto the pitch in solidarity with the victims of earthquakes. After overcoming numerous obstacles connected to the Northern Ireland Protocol, the so-called Windsor Framework was agreed upon at meeting between European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Klaudia Czerwińska has the details.
It's been a busy few weeks for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who has been working to secure a new post-Brexit trading agreement. Monday brought a decisive breakthrough in EU-UK negotiations following talks held with EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in Windsor earlier today. Finally, after news broke that the deal known as the Windsor Framework was struck, Prime Minister Sunak and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen confirmed the breakthrough at a press briefing held at Windsor Castle.
This agreement delivers smooth-flowing trade within the whole United Kingdom, protects Northern Ireland's place in our union, and safeguards sovereignty for the people of Northern Ireland.
This new framework will allow us to begin a new chapter. It provides for long-lasting solutions that both of us are confident will work for all people and businesses in Northern Ireland.
Questions immediately emerged about the agreement's impact on how trade is handled between Northern Ireland, the UK and the EU, and how it will be taxed. Just a quick reminder, the Northern Ireland Protocol came into power in early 2021 and triggered legal action by the EU in response to alleged breaches of the protocol clauses. In February 2022, the Democratic Unionist Party pulled out of the Northern Ireland Assembly in protest. The DUP is yet to accept the deal which was negotiated by Prime Minister Sunak.
They've been opposed to the protocol. They've been grumbling in the background about the way Rishi Sunak's negotiated without consulting them very much. So they could still potentially be an obstacle to this. It's then a political decision by Rishi Sunak does he go ahead with the reform protocol irrespective of the DUP and, in a sense, call their bluff, or does he wait until they agree, in which case he might be waiting forever?
Upon her visit, Mrs. von der Leyen met with King Charles at Windsor Castle, a reflection of a balancing act between a monarch who is politically neutral and maintaining an important constitutional role. It might take days before DUP and Tory backbenchers will be able to get through the legal documents, and we hear of any pushbacks. However, real test will be to get the DUP's approval of the new terms and conditions. Another important moment in the process of embracing the change will be the parliamentary vote on agreement, a significant hurdle that must be overcome before the deal becomes legally binding. From London for TVP World, Klaudia Czerwińska.
2023 marks the 9th year since Russia began its aggression against Ukraine. Ever since the start of the full-scale invasion, many have been wondering how long this conflict can go on. Our correspondent Don Arlett is in Kharkiv and has this report.
Russia may be changing its strategy and how it fights the war here in Ukraine. That's according to the latest British intelligence assessment, which says that over the past few weeks, Russia has been seeking to prolong this war as long as possible in order to exhaust Ukrainian resources and tire Ukrainian fighters, as well as exhaust Western support of the country, both financially and militarily. Also, this British assessment says that Russia is no longer seeking to gain ground, but to hold what it already has. Now, if we look at the another intelligence assessment that came out of Kiev today, according to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia still seeks to target civilian infrastructure, especially critical infrastructure such as electricity and, of course, fuel supply. With the amount of generators that has been employed in the country over the last several weeks and months, taking out fuel is also a top priority of Russia. Then there's also the Chinese peace plan, which is a 12-point strategy. Ukraine has said that it likes some of the points, but what makes it pretty much a non-starter here in Ukraine is the fact that it does not recognize, or at least doesn't have a provision that recognizes the borders that were established back in 1991 when the Soviet Union was broken up. Ukraine obviously will not accept any territorial gains by Russia, including Crimea and the Donbass region, as well as Zaporizhia and what is left of Kherson region. Russia said earlier today that it is still interested in such a deal. Any deal that would bring peace seems to be attractive for Russians. However, with the big difference in opinions on whether to recognize or not recognize those territorial gains that Russia claims to have made, is definitely the sticking point of the Chinese peace plan. And also, the United States has watered down the idea that the plan would actually be employed. Don Arlett reporting from Kharkiv, TVP World.
Monday, February 27th, marks the 8th anniversary of the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. The former Russian deputy prime minister and later opposition leader was murdered just steps away from the Kremlin. Here's our report.
Until last year, anti-Kremlin Russian activists took to the streets every year to honor the memory of murdered opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. Though the event draws significantly smaller crowd nowadays, many people still commemorate his death.
Boris Nemtsov could have become the best president of our country out of anyone I know, but there are no people like him anymore.
The staunch critic of Putin's regime was killed with 4 shots to back late on the evening of February 27, 2015, on the Great Moscow Bridge near the Kremlin.
He was a leader of the democratic movement, a hero of our time.
Nemtsov's family and supporters say the likely perpetrators of the murder have been brought to justice, but those who ordered the killing were never punished. A final indictment was brought against 4 suspects in July 2017. A Moscow court quickly sentenced Zaur Dadayev to 20 years in a penal colony. Investigators claimed it was Dadayev who fired shots at Nemtsov. The court hearing itself took only half an hour. The investigation was hasty and many clues were left out.
the only person who really wanted his death the most is in Kremlin now. So this case could not be investigated at all.
Nemtsov was a vocal critic of Moscow's annexation of the Crimea and predicted that Russia would soon attempt to continue its offensive into Ukraine. He was shot just days after announcing that he had prepared a report showcasing Moscow's plans for the attack. Any attempts to commemorate Nemtsov's memory have been brutally suppressed by the Kremlin.
The prosecutor in Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya's trial in absentia has demanded a 19-year sentence for the opposition leader. The exiled politician has called the trial a sham and added that the prosecution's request only gives her extra motivation.
Almost each week brings a new political trial in Belarus. The dictatorship is trying to stamp out every sign of opposition. Not everyone is kept in a cage during their trial, though. Some have managed to flee the country before they could be detained. The trial of Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya is being conducted in absentia.
It has nothing to do with justice. It is just personal revenge against me and others who are opposing the regime. It will only make us fight even harder.
A regime prosecutor has also asked for a 19-year sentence for another significant opposition figure, Pavel Latushka. Latushka has recently decided to leave the Cooperation Council, a movement associated with Tsikhanouskaya, over a difference of opinions.
The criminal case is being considered by the regime's court for activities in the Coordination Council and the Democratic Forces of Belarus. It motivates me to keep fighting.
According to Human Rights Center Vyazna, there are currently around 1,500 political prisoners in Belarus. The large-scale repressions in the country began after the presidential elections in 2020. The results of which are widely believed to be falsified. The United States, as well as the European Union and many other Western countries, did not recognize the outcome of the vote.
Election week has begun in Estonia. The voters can choose between casting their ballots in person or online. These parliamentary elections are different from previous ones in many aspects. Polls open today in Estonia, where citizens have the option of casting their votes online or in person. While election day is on Sunday, many have chosen to vote early. Voters who submitted their ballots online have until the end of the week to change their vote. Online votes can also be cancelled by casting a paper ballot. This year, candidates can campaign throughout the week, including on Sunday, which was not permitted in the previous parliamentary elections in 2019. To learn more about elections in Estonia, stay with us for an interview with Professor Andres Kesekamp, head of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, right after the news. In Nigeria's presidential elections, opposition dark horse Peter Obi won in the commercial hub of Lagos on Monday. Still, counting in 2/3 of the country continues to render the future of Africa's wealthiest nation a true political cliffhanger.
Nigeria's elections have been marred by delays, irregularities and incidents of violence. In Lagos, 15 men pretending to be electoral officials broke into a voting collation center and attacked Labour Party agents with knives and clubs. Despite the incident, wildcard presidential hopeful Peter Obi of the Labour Party managed to secure a victory in Nigeria's commercial hub on Monday, but he may not be victorious.
Bola Tinubu, running on the ticket of the incumbent ruling party, is probably would probably win.
According to provisional results announced by electoral officials in 10 of Nigeria's 36 states, Bola Tinubu from the governing All Progressive Congress Party leads with about 3.29 million votes against 2.28 million for Atiku Abubakar of the main opposition People's Democratic Party and 818 for Obi. But despite the winner of the presidential race, little to no change in Nigeria's foreign policy is to be expected.
Nigeria is one of the most Western-oriented countries of the region, so that would continue. There is a strong pro-European and pro-American, like pro-Atlantic, we may say so, vector of the foreign policy. If West Africa is very much penetrated by Russia, particularly in French-speaking countries, Nigeria is not with them.
To win the presidential election, a candidate needs a simple majority, provided they have garnered at least a quarter of the votes cast in at least 24 states. Should no candidate achieve that, a runoff will be held within 21 days.
You're watching Midnight Edition of World News. Coming up next. Hundreds of thousands take to the streets of Mexico City to protest reforms. And Belarusian dissidents destroy a Russian military aircraft near Minsk. More bodies are being pulled from the ocean following a deadly shipwreck off the coast of Italy. 62 deaths have been reported thus far. Irregular migrants continue to board wrecked boats and the hundreds ready to risk it all.
Coffins laid out near the beach on the coast of Italy serve as a grim symbol of the ongoing migrant crisis. Italian authorities discovered yet another body following a migrant shipwreck on Sunday. Authorities believe 180 to 200 people were on board the ship, carrying migrants from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Syria.
They are aware not only that they are risking their lives, but that they are embarking with traffickers. They arrive with their life savings to make the crossing.
Italy is located along the popular Central Mediterranean migratory route, which is one of the most used paths to Europe. The country serves as a gateway into the European Union, but has ramped up efforts to decrease the amount of irregular migration into the country. Unfortunately, this makes little to no difference.
We keep hearing, I would rather die at sea than go back to Libya. So rules like this will never stop people from making that crossing. People on the run will not stop trying to find safety.
This migratory route has seen a record 100,000 crossings in the past year, but also over 20,000 deaths and disappearances since 2016. The Central Mediterranean route has been dubbed as the most dangerous crossing in the world.
Dozens of deaths, including children. The Five-Star Movement has been asking for years a management of migration flows shared with Europe. Continuing to wait is proving inhumane.
Italy is one of the so-called countries of first entry, bearing a great burden in protecting European borders. The country's authorities have long called for a framework of greater cooperation in managing the unprecedented flow of migrants into the bloc.
Over 500,000 people took to the streets in Mexico City to protest the country's latest electoral reform approved by the Senate. Protesters believe the move, which will restrict the State Electoral Commission, is a direct threat to the country's democracy.
This was the largest protest yet against the administration of President López Obrador. Over 500,000 people poured into Mexico City's main square, outraged over efforts to curtail the country's electoral authority.
The people marching here want to protect the National Electoral Institute and thus to defend the transparency of the elections. The referee cannot be allowed to be touched. The reform puts the quality of elections in Mexico at risk.
The newly passed reform looks to abolish 300 electoral commissions and sack 85% of the electoral authority's career staff. Critics have vowed to take the controversial legislation to the Supreme Court, which they believe would overturn it.
Most of us are here to exercise the people's right to protest. I think the Supreme Court and the justices will make a good decision not to support the president.
The reform could also see some of the state electoral commission's powers handed over to the Supreme Court.
We want to tell the Supreme Court that we trust them. We trust their democratic attitude and their capacity to understand the importance of the decision they will make.
With 72 votes in favor and 50 against, the law was passed by the Senate on Wednesday. The opposition began voicing its concerns immediately after the vote.
Mexicans should take note of the name of the author of this attempt to destroy democracy.
The people of Mexico should be warned that what the ruling party wants to do is a betrayal of the democratic pact.
López Obrador has been pushing to reform the INE since 2018. The president argues the body is too biased in favor of his opponents, but denies that change to the agency could weaken democracy.
At least one Palestinian is dead and hundreds are wounded after Israeli settlers attacked Palestinians in the West Bank. The violence was sparked by the deadly shooting of two settlers on Sunday.
Violence has once again erupted in the West Bank. Israelis living in settlements in the occupied territories attacked Palestinians, injuring nearly 400 and killing at least one. Houses, businesses and cars were torched.
The settlers attacked and broke windows, so we lied down on the floor. We started to hear sounds from outside the house. I moved towards the window in our room, but there was shooting, so I lied back down on the floor. Then they broke the windows. My mother moved us to a corner because there was no safe place. They broke all the windows while we were inside.
The attacks come in response to the deadly shooting of 2 Israelis near the Palestinian village of Huwara on Sunday. The search for the gunman is ongoing. Israeli Minister for National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is usually very supportive of settlers, called on them to stop the violence.
I
understand the hard feelings, but this is not the way. We do not take the law into our own hands. The Israeli government, the State of Israel, the IDF, the security forces, they are the ones who should be crushing our enemies.
The attacks came hours after Israeli and Palestinian officials agreed to de-escalate the violence taking place in the region. The last few months have been among the deadliest for the West Bank since the end of the Second Intifada in 2005. It appears that Israeli government is finding it harder to control settlers as parties representing their interest have increased leverage in the new administration.
These are all political acts for the international community to show that everything is under control, that there is cooperation and that such incidents are minor issues. But the fact is, these are not minor issues. These are directly connected to the people, us, the civilians, who have nothing to do with politics, but we end up suffering from the harm of the settlers.
Terrorist attacks are being conducted by new Palestinian groups, which are outside the control of authorities in Ramallah. Cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian leadership may no longer guarantee calm, as violence is increasingly happening at the grassroots level.
Belarusian dissidents claim to have blown up a Russian military aircraft base outside of Minsk. This would mark the first armed action from anti-government activists in Belarus to date.
In the early hours of last Sunday, a Russian aircraft stationed at a Belarusian airbase outside Minsk found itself the target of an attack. The Belarusian group BIPOL, composed of former state security and law enforcement officers, claimed responsibility for the action.
The attack was carried out by Belarusian partisans, participants in the Victory Plan. Drones were really used. There were 2 explosions. One hit the aircraft's dish, while the other one was in the fuselage area. The aircraft was severely damaged.
The target of the attack was a Beriev A-50, a Russian airborne warning and control aircraft. Fitted with a large radar, the A-50 is tasked with airspace control and surveillance. Russia owns only a handful of these platforms, and likely less than 10 are operational. The loss of even one will significantly affect Moscow's air operations.
In general, this aircraft was used by the Russians on the territory of Belarus to conduct reconnaissance in Ukraine for the purpose of directing missile strikes. Whenever it took off, it was usually followed by aircraft carrying Kinjal missiles, and soon air raid alerts would be sounded across Ukraine.
Some Russian commentators say that the attack was conducted by Ukraine using long-range drones, but BIPOL denies this.
If these were not Belarusian partisans, we would not have claimed responsibility. Then there's the question of Belarusian air defense, which would have to somehow miss the drones allegedly flying in from the Chernihiv region, crossing much of Belarusian territory, and then finally arriving to strike in Machulishchi.
Officials in Minsk have not released any statements or comments on the incident. The raid would mark the first time Belarusian dissidents conducted an armed attack inside the country's borders.
Turkey is still dealing with the aftermath of the earthquakes that struck the country in early February. As aid for the affected areas continues to flow in from all over the globe, a deeply moving scene recently took place at a football match in Istanbul. More in this story.
In the wake of the devastating earthquakes that left thousands dead, Turkey has seen an outpouring of support from all over the world. But the latest show of love took place here at the Istanbul Stadium. Thousands of toys, plushies, blankets, and scarves rained down onto the field as the match hit the 4-minute and 17-second mark, a reference to the hour that the first deadly quakes began. The toys collected at the game between Besiktas and Antalyaspor are meant for children from the hardest-hit regions of Turkey. The game was promptly resumed after a few minutes of cleanup.
And now, as announced to discuss Estonia's parliamentary elections, we're joined by Professor Andres Kesekam, Director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. Good evening.
Good evening.
So 9 parties are racing for the victory in parliamentary elections in Estonia, but not all of them can obviously dream of taking it all. So which parties have the biggest support now, and which can count on forming a new government?
Well, you're entirely right that not all the parties can actually make it into the parliament. First thing to know is that we have proportional representation, and there's a 5% threshold. So it's not expected that there will be more than 6 parties that will actually be in parliament. So usually Estonia has had somewhere between 4 and 6 parties in the parliament, and that has meant we have almost always had coalition governments, coalitions of 2 or 3 and sometimes even 4 political parties. At the moment, there is the Prime Minister's party, the Liberal Reform Party, which is in the lead, but that's led by Kaja Kallas, who is the most popular candidate to become Prime Minister, but she is dependent on her junior partners also receiving enough votes to get a majority to form a coalition. And that's the big question. So I think it's fairly clear that the Prime Minister's Reform Party will get the most votes, but they will need to rely on at least 2 other parties to join them to have a majority coalition.
Right. So according to your predictions, Kaja Kallas stays in the office, right?
No, that's not exactly what I said. I think she will win. She will get the most votes. Her party will get the most votes. But it's entirely possible that the party that comes in second and third will be able to form a coalition with some other partner. That has happened before. Now, so the second 2 largest parties are, first of all, the EKRE, which is the Estonian Conservative People's Party, which is the far-right populist party. And that's closely followed by the Center Party, which enjoys most of the support of the Russian speakers in Estonia. And they could possibly combine with another party if they do well enough to have a majority.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
So it's all about, so one thing is the election result, and the next is the arithmetic of putting together a coalition afterwards. So
obviously, sure.
Even if Kaja Kallas wins, then that doesn't mean she'll be forming the government again.
Okay. Now, about Russians, 1/4 of the Estonian voters, if I'm not mistaken, are ethnic Russians. So how will they vote? For the far right, or for the party you already mentioned, the center one?
Well, first of all, when we talk about Russian speakers, it's a differentiated group, of course. That doesn't mean they're all ethnic Russians as such, but they're the ones who use Russian as their main language at home. Up to now, it's been the Center Party, which has had a lock on the Russian electorate, which the majority of Russians have always voted in favor of. And the Center Party is, as the name suggests, a party of the center left, which has a sort of populist leaning and has big support among pensioners and people in the countryside and amongst the Russian speakers. But they've been losing support to this new far-right party, EKRE. And this is a really difficult moment for the Russian speakers, in the sense that the far-right party appears
Hello, this is Maciej Mikos welcoming you to World Today. 1 year after Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the support for the so-called special military operation remains high. Well, at least according to the official propaganda. What is the reason for this state of affairs? Have sanctions imposed on Putin's regime failed? And what do Russians themselves think of the future of their country under Putin's rule? Here to answer these questions, we're joined by Łukasz Kondraciuk from the International Republican Institute. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me, Maciej.
So only 6% Russians less support the war in Ukraine in comparison with the last year's survey by Levada Center. Now, how to explain this huge support?
I have an utmost respect for Levada and their work, but I think in the current situation in Russia, it is very difficult to do any credible polling. Russians obviously don't feel free to express their opinion, and that has impact on polling numbers. Another factor is, even if we were to believe those numbers were very accurate, is the omnipresent propaganda. Very few Russians have access or want to have access to credible information about what is going on in Ukraine. Another factor is that the sanctions that you mentioned, obviously, which are a very good thing to do, and they are the right thing to impose from the ethical perspective, on our end. Those sanctions are mostly felt by people in larger cities. The core supporters of the ruling regime of the United Russia Party, according to a number of other polls, even those conducted before the war, indicate that the real strength of the United Russia Party and the Kremlin regime is in the province, older people and women. Those people do not live the life of the middle class. They live a very simple life, very poor life. Their lifestyles don't differ much from that of their ancestors, their grandparents. So sanctions don't really hit them directly. We're talking about people who live without running water, without toilets inside their houses or apartments, with very little access to 21st century civilization. It is absolutely right thing to do. If Russians think that killing, raping, and kidnapping Ukrainian children is the morally right thing to do, then I think we have every
right. But the question is whether they actually think that, because according to a quite a different survey, we learned that, according to an alleged secret report published lately by the Medusa, a media outlet, only 25% of Russians support the war, and more than a half would like the conflict in Ukraine to end by Russia entering some sort of peace talks with Ukraine. So, which studies in the end are we to believe?
That is a very, very, very good question, and I think that the way Russian society thinks sometimes is that they can have two contradictory opinions at the same time. Russians, it has been raised by numbers of sociologists. Russians, when asked about their opinion on certain matters, they don't respond according to their idea of a consensus, but they respond to according to what they think everyone else thinks. They don't want to be a minority. It is very difficult in contemporary Russia to have an opinion that is different from that of the Kremlin, because you are very lonely. It is very difficult to find people like you around you, particularly in this very difficult time for Russia's civil society, whatever is left of it, with people leaving, with the opposition incarcerated, dead. Today is the 8th anniversary of Boris Nemtsov's murder. So I think it is absolutely plausible for average Russians, many brainwashed by propaganda, to have two contradictory opinions at the same time. They just don't want to stand out. They don't have the full picture, or they don't believe that they do, and they don't want to be, they want to be the only ones in their community to think differently.
Right, but now, Łukasz, I'd like us to listen to one of the Russians who's very vocal about her opinions on the war in Ukraine. So let's listen to Yekaterina Varenik from Moscow. Let's give it a listen.
I wanted to do it for a long time, but I was scared. After the Dnipro rocket attack on January 14th, I realized that there was simply nothing to be afraid of compared to the fear that people in Ukraine endure on a daily basis. I gathered my strength and went out to the impromptu memorial at the Lesia Ukrainka monument in Moscow. The level of adrenaline was crazy. People came up, supported me. It was very pleasant. Then I was detained, went to court and was charged with 2 offenses of the Russian Administrative Court, 19.3, disobedience to the authorities, and 20.3.3, discrediting the armed forces. You used to see Z's and V's, symbols used by the Russian army in Ukraine when driving around major roads in Moscow. Now I don't think that anyone will argue. There are almost none of them. I don't know what it means. Maybe a light bulb moment is not far away, as one would think.
Right, so there may be some changes on the horizon in Russia, but firstly I'd like us to discuss other aspects of the Russian propaganda and the lies they are spreading. Now, how are Russians reacting to the fact that children of the very same propagandists who urged them to join the ranks of the army and to fight in Ukraine now are not willing to make that share in Russia's war effort?
I think there is probably a sizable population of the Russian intellectual, pro-democracy, pro-Western elites that are not pleased with the fact, but at the same time, the core supporters of the regime that I mentioned, I don't think they care. I don't think this is something that will change their mind. And the video we just played of the very brave Moscow resident is very telling for a number of reasons. First of all, she is from Moscow, so she's from traditionally anti-regime, relatively anti-regime town, right? Living in Moscow, having lived in Moscow, she was exposed to, to the core real Russian Democrats, pro-Western, anti-regime, right? She was surrounded by like-minded young people at her university. I would guess she was surrounded by people who had frequently traveled to Europe and who brought those ideas and concepts from our part of the world back to Russia. But we are talking about a relatively small size of the Russian population. Many Russians, like I said, they don't even have running water or toilets in their homes. Not mentioning travel to Europe, right, or the United States.
Right, sure,
Russians
I understand
really
it, but there's a huge difference between supporting your government and all the heinous actions that Putin's clique has been doing for such a long time, and the other thing is actually taking up arms and going to fight your alleged enemy. So, for these inhabitants of the vast Russian province, is it an honor to die for Vladimir Putin?
I don't think this is an honor to die for Vladimir Putin, but for them and their families, this is the only chance, this is the only shot they have in their lifetimes to have a different life. The money transfers, the rewards, the sheer salaries that they are being paid to go and fight in the war. We saw all those pictures and probably rolled our eyes or laughed at them when the famous or infamous family exchanged their son for a Lada, right? In Russia, this is the only way currently to go up the social ladder, right? You basically sacrifice one of yours. There's a high chance that the person will not be coming back, but you go to the war and you know that your family will be taken care of, or there's a high chance that it will be should the military authorities keep their promise. And if you look at the very many videos of Russian soldiers, the mobilized ones, protesting and refusing to go to the war, they're not really saying, we don't want to go to the war because we don't want to kill and rape and steal, right? They're saying we want better weapons, we want better uniforms, we want to kill Ukrainians more effectively, and we want to have a slightly less chance of dying. But this is very characteristic for a society that is dependent on social benefits, so very Sovietized, right? Like in Soviet Union, you couldn't really live without the state, without the government, and making Russian society poor, one of the objectives of Vladimir Putin, especially in the provinces, not in the pockets of wealth such as St. Petersburg or Moscow or a couple of other cities in Russia, helps him achieve that goal. The second factor is that Russian society doesn't really have a history like the one in Germany where I live, right? Before 1945, they basically lived in the same totalitarian circumstances. The Russians went straight from an absolute monarchy into Bolshevism, into Stalinism, into communism, into Putinism. They never had a time off, a time to breathe and talk about what kind of society they want to be, what kind of society they really are.
Well, there was a slight attempt in the early 1990s, but it didn't work out for Russians, right?
It didn't work out for Russians. It didn't really work that well, and it didn't really produce a lot of high-quality elected officials. It did produce some, I'll give them that, but, when Vladimir Putin was taking over, so the very late 90s, by many, Russia was still considered to be a somewhat democratic country, right? But then it turned out that the democracy backslided so easily that it just wasn't built into that the spine of that country well enough.
Mm-hmm. Right, now about Russia's patriotism. Now, lately Vladimir Putin has been alarming his audience that the collective West would like to see Russia partitioned, right? Now, does he have any valid grounds for such a statement? I mean, if Russia does lose the war in Ukraine, is there a possibility that it will fall apart?
The definition of Russia falling apart, I think it would be a relatively long one with a lot of possible scenarios and side scenarios. So we would have to define that first. The fact remains that Russia is extremely ethnically diverse, right? And a large chunk of what is Russian Federation today was basically colonized internally, right? Also, another fact is that a lot of parts of Russia are extremely beautiful and very rich in natural resources. It is also true that the companies that exploit those natural resources, they mostly pay taxes in Moscow because that's where they are registered, right? They're basically stealing the best of what particular land has to offer, let's say Siberia, and the region doesn't get anything in return. I think, if we were to travel to Russia, maybe in more peaceful time, we would see how diverse it is, even in terms of, sort of management style, right? The Russian Democrats have always told me the story about falsification in elections, how different that process, looks in, let's say, Siberia or Moscow or some of the other ethnic republics in Russia. Breaking away, as Putin said, the biggest tragedy, geopolitical tragedy, was the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think it is an objective of his and those around him to not let Russia disintegrate any further. And I think he was speaking to that. I think he's being pressured by local governors, right? So basically people he appointed, because he's appointing a vast majority of them. And there are no direct elections of mayors in Russia today, apart from, I think, 5 or 6 cities across the country. I think this is something that will hopefully keep him busy at home. And as a result of that, he will have less time, less capacity for foreign adventurism, like the one we see in Ukraine.
Well, hopefully. Putin is also relentless in threatening the West with a possible nuclear attack on Ukraine. Now, when I ask these questions here in the studio, I often hear that it's an absolute bluff from the Kremlin. But is the Russian society taking such a possibility seriously?
Russian society doesn't take the possibility of having anything related to state affairs under control. That is the first thing, right? The center of power is so detached from the common folk in Russia that I don't think Russians individually or as a society have the ability to assume responsibility of what the state is going to do. I also think that we have to consider that when you talk about society in that particular context, that Russians think they live in a different country than they really do. The propaganda keeps telling them that Russia, you're showing a military parade, has a military, the second strongest military in the world. Well, that was verified by the war in Ukraine, but the Russians wouldn't know it because propaganda doesn't tell them the whole truth about Russians' losses, right? Russians, particularly those who support the ruling regime in Russia, they do think that Russia is and should remain an empire, and should have the capacity to do whatever it wants in its neighborhood and perhaps even beyond. Whether or not Russia will actually go for that very extreme solution. I am not a military expert and I have no idea, but there's also one factor to consider. The maintenance, right, of anything in Russia is just rotten with corruption. I have my own doubts, and I believe that military experts do as well, whether those nuclear warheads have been maintained for the last couple of years. But again, Russian people would not know it because the Russian television will not tell them that, and there is no system of checks and balances, and there is no free media that could go and inspect the installations and write about it, demand that it be fixed. Thank God.
Right. Having a large nuclear arsenal gives you a huge edge over your opponents, right? And therefore, I'm wondering whether Russians simply believe that they cannot be defeated, whatever happens.
This is what they are being told currently in Russia, right? Whether they genuinely believe it or whether this is a defense mechanism, that is a relatively difficult question. Whether this is sort of a lie they decide to believe, but again, there's also the burden of the Second World War, right? About which Russian society is being reminded every single day, starting from basically kindergarten. And I think a large chunk of the society still remembers, either directly or from their parents, their grandparents, how horrible war that took place on the territory of Russia was. I'm talking about the Second World War, and they want to avoid it by any means necessary, and that is having this tremendous, rallying around the flag effect that we actually do see as per some polling, but as per other polling, we don't see it that much. But I think it actually is there. There's little visible dissent in Russia, although there is a fair degree of that is not seen. Russians are engaging in helping Ukrainians kidnapped from Ukraine return or leave Russia, right? Russians are engaged in finding kidnapped Ukrainian children. They're not doing this in large numbers, but there are Russians who are actually involved in these efforts. So this is not black and white either.
Right. Now, as we're still discussing Russia's actual power, now is the Russian army unable to start this major offensive we've been hearing so much about, or is it already ongoing?
I am absolutely not a military expert, and I cannot speak to that. The only thing that I'm afraid of is that in the event Putin actually decides to mobilize even more, additional hundreds of thousands of soldiers, many will actually enlist, either forcibly or perhaps, hopefully, a minority voluntarily. But we did see what happened with the first mobilization attempt. There was little protest, or there was actually little violent protest, right? Those men, able-bodied, they decided not to protest. They decide to flee. They decide to escape the easiest route that they have. And I also think, and it is not easy for me to say this, but this is this is symptomatic of where Russian civil society or society at large is at this point.
Right, I ask you this question because it also reflects on the official propaganda. And for the next question is, what are the Russians fighting for now? Because in the beginning it was the total denazification, or, well, the aim was to erase Ukraine, to put it simply. And now we hear more and more often that it's only about the Ukraine's east and parts of the Ukrainian coast. So which is it?
I think Russians are fighting for survival of the current political. That's number one. Be that with or without the men in charge. Vladimir Putin cannot survive without Putinism, but I think Putinism can actually survive without Vladimir Putin. So he's not really critical, as critical as we think here. And I think that the powers that be in Russia are very intentionally keeping the actual objectives of the war, the so-called special military operation, vague. Because they cannot plan for an outcome that they can actually achieve, and they sound credible. I'm afraid that a large portion of Russian society will believe that Russia actually won when they will be told that Russia actually won, and no one will verify what that means, right? The Russians know, the Russian society does recognize that tens of thousands of soldiers are already gone, that people are coming back young men coming back without their limbs, that many Russian children will have to grow up without fathers, which will have grave implications of the future of Russia, grave implications, a horrible increase in criminality, probably for the next 2 generations. But as I said, Russian society, or the core part of Russian society that is needed for the regime to survive, will believe that Russia won the war when they will be said that Russia won the war.
Right, so you said it's about Putin's survival. Now, then on the other hand, Russian oppositionists abroad are working very actively to put an end to Putin's regime. Now, how are the actions perceived in Russia? Are they considered rather traitors, or a real possible, alternative for Russia to replace Putin?
This is a very complicated question, and I think that we really should recognize those, as I said, inside Russia, doing all the good deeds that I mentioned, those outside of Russia trying to weaken the system, and many of them are very good people and very, very, very skilled politicians, right? And we also have a number of very skilled and very good politicians who are imprisoned in Russia. But the fact remains, if you want to be politically successful, if you want to be politically efficient, you actually need voters. You actually need people to vote for you, right? And in current Russia, the institution of elections doesn't really exist, and has not existed for a number of years, with certain exceptions on which we did actually focus on. What will come next in Russia, in terms of political system, is a mystery, and I think we should work hard to try to decipher that mystery, whether this will be a democracy in which people will be able to participate in the elections, and the opposition that is in exile at this point will be able to go back to the country and actually field candidates and actually win seats and actually govern. That's only one possibility. The other possibility is that Russia, after the war, will be poorer, will be much weaker, will be much more difficult to manage. But the guy who's in charge right now will remain in charge, right? There's also a possibility of some kind of a mild improvement. I'm thinking, sort of Central Asia, perhaps Uzbekistan, in which there will not be too much democracy, or the democracy that is there will be very tightly controlled. But it will seem to us better than it is now. I think the future of Russia depends more on the development of the Russian society from here, sort of post-war, right? Rather than individuals coming back, although there are many that I keep my fingers crossed for, because there are many Russians who actually believe that Russia should be a pro-Western democratic country, not the warmongering one that it is now.
Right, so the future of Russia remains a mystery, and a mystery in this case doesn't sound good, not at all. Łukasz Ondraciuk from the International Republican Institute was our guest today. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
And that would be all in this episode of World Today. Thank you for watching, but don't go away, as Military Mind is coming up next.
Coffins laid out near the beach on the coast of Italy serve as a grim symbol of the ongoing migrant crisis. Italian authorities discovered yet another body following a migrant shipwreck on Sunday. Authorities believe 180 to 200 people were on board the ship carrying migrants from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Syria.
They are aware not only that they are risking their lives, but that they are embarking with traffickers. They arrive with their life savings to make the crossing.
Italy is located along the popular Central Mediterranean migratory route, which is one of the most used paths to Europe. The country serves as a gateway into the European Union, but has ramped up efforts to decrease the amount of irregular migration into the country. Unfortunately, this makes little to no difference.
We keep hearing, I would rather die at sea than go back to Libya. So rules like this will never stop people from making that crossing. People on the run will not stop trying to find safety.
This migratory route has seen a record 100,000 crossings in the past year, but also over 20,000 deaths and disappearances since 2016. The Central Mediterranean route has been dubbed as the most dangerous crossing in the world.
Dozens of deaths, including children. The Five-Star Movement has been asking for years a management of migration flows shared with Europe. Continuing to wait is proving inhumane.
Italy is one of the so-called countries of first entry, bearing a great burden in protecting European borders. The country's authorities have long called for a framework of greater cooperation in managing the unprecedented flow of migrants into the bloc.
Until last year, anti-Kremlin Russian activists took to the streets every year to honor the memory of murdered opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. Though the event draws significantly smaller crowd nowadays, many people still commemorate his death.
Boris Nemtsov could have become the best president of our country out of anyone I know, but there are no people like him anymore.
The staunch critic of Putin's regime was killed with 4 shots to back late on the evening of February 27, 2015, on the Great Moscow Bridge near the Kremlin.
He was a leader of the democratic movement, a hero of our time.
Nemtsov's family and supporters say the likely perpetrators of the murder have been brought to justice, but those who ordered the killing were never punished. A final indictment was brought against 4 suspects in July 2017. A Moscow court quickly sentenced Zaur Dadayev to 20 years in a penal colony. Investigators claimed it was Dadayev who fired shots at Nemtsov. The court hearing itself took only half an hour. The investigation was hasty and many clues were left out.
The only person who really wanted his death the most is in Kremlin now. So this case could not be investigated at all.
Nemtsov was a vocal critic of Moscow's annexation of the Crimea and predicted that Russia would soon attempt to continue its offensive into Ukraine. He was shot just days after announcing that he had prepared a report showcasing Moscow's plans for the attack. Any attempts to commemorate Nemtsov's memory have been brutally suppressed by the Kremlin.
Nigeria's elections have been marred by delays, irregularities, and incidents of violence. In Lagos, 15 men pretending to be electoral officials broke into a voting collation center and attacked Labour Party agents with knives and clubs. Despite the incident, wildcard presidential hopeful Peter Obi of the Labour Party managed to secure a victory in Nigeria's commercial hub on Monday, but he may not be victorious.
Bola Tinubu, running on the ticket of the incumbent ruling party, is probably will probably win.
According to provisional results announced by electoral officials in 10 of Nigeria's 36 states, Bola Tinubu from the governing All Progressive Congress Party leads with about 3.29 million votes against 2.28 million for Atiku Abubakar of the main opposition People's Democratic Party and 818 for Obi. But despite the winner of the presidential race, little to no change in Nigeria's foreign policy is to be expected.
Nigeria is one of the most Western-oriented countries of the region, so that would continue. There is a strong pro-European and pro-American, like pro-Atlantic, we may say so, vector of the foreign policy. If West Africa is very much penetrated by Russia, particularly in French-speaking countries, Nigeria is not with them.
To win the presidential election, a candidate needs a simple majority, provided they have garnered at least a quarter of the votes cast in at least 24 states. Should no candidate achieve that, a runoff will be held within 21 days.
In the early hours of last Sunday, a Russian aircraft stationed at a Belarusian airbase outside Minsk found itself the target of an attack. The Belarusian group BIPOL, composed of former state security and law enforcement officers, claimed responsibility for the action.
The attack was carried out by Belarusian participants in the victory plan. Drones were really used. There were 2 explosions. One hit the aircraft's dish, while the other one was in the fuselage area. The aircraft was severely damaged.
The target of the attack was a Beriev A-50, a Russian airborne warning and control aircraft. Fitted with a large radar, the A-50 is tasked with airspace control and surveillance. Russia owns only a handful of these platforms, and likely less than 10 are operational. The loss of even one will significantly affect Moscow's air operations.
In general, this aircraft was used by the Russians on the territory of Belarus to conduct reconnaissance in Ukraine for the purpose of directing missile strikes. Whenever it took off, it was usually followed by aircraft carrying Kinjal missiles, and soon air raid alerts would be sounded across Ukraine.
Some Russian commentators say that the attack was conducted by Ukraine using long-range drones, but BIPOL denies this.
If these were not Belarusian partisans, we would not have claimed responsibility. Then there's the question of Belarusian air defense, which would have to somehow miss the drones allegedly flying in from the Chernihiv region, crossing much of Belarusian territory, and then finally arriving to strike in Machulishchi.
Officials in Minsk have not released any statements or comments on the incident. The raid would mark the first time Belarusian dissidents conducted an armed attack inside the country's borders.
Russia may be changing its strategy and how it fights the war here in Ukraine. That's according to the latest British intelligence assessment, which says that over the past few weeks, Russia has been seeking to prolong this war as long as possible in order to exhaust Ukrainian resources and tire Ukrainian fighters, as well as exhaust Western support of the country, both financially and militarily. Also, this British assessment says that Russia is no longer seeking to gain ground, but to hold what it already has. Now, if we look at another intelligence assessment that came out of Kiev today, according to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia still seeks to target civilian infrastructure, especially critical infrastructure such as electricity and, of course, fuel supply. With the amount of generators that has been employed in the country over the last several weeks and months, taking out fuel is also a top priority of Russia. Then there's also the Chinese peace plan, which is a 12-point strategy. Ukraine has said that it likes some of the points, but what makes it pretty much a non-starter here in Ukraine is the fact that it does not recognize, or at least doesn't have a provision that recognizes the borders that were established back in 1991 when the Soviet Union was broken up. Ukraine obviously will not accept any territorial gains by Russia, including Crimea and the Donbass region, as well as Zaporizhia and what is left of Kherson region. Russia said earlier today that it is still interested in such a deal. Any deal that would bring peace seems to be attractive for Russians. However, with the big difference in opinions on whether to recognize or not recognize those territorial gains that Russia claims to have made, is definitely the sticking point of the Chinese peace plan. And also, the United States has watered down the idea that the plan would actually be employed. Don Arleth, reporting from Kharkiv, TVP World.
Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad has had quite a busy schedule in recent weeks, and that's not just because of the humanitarian crisis brewing at home. Following a visit to Oman on February 20th, Assad received Egypt's foreign minister Sameh Shoukry in Damascus today.
The goal of the visit is primarily humanitarian and to express our solidarity.
But it is implicitly understood that on such occasions other topics are discussed behind closed doors. Taking advantage of the recent outpouring of humanitarian aid for Syria from other Arab states, Bashar al-Assad has seized the opportunity to re-establish diplomatic communication channels. The revival comes after years of alienation that began in 2011, when the Arab Spring protests spread into Syria. A bloody civil war ensued and has ravaged the country ever since. Syria has been suspended from the Arab League, the largest international organization uniting Arab states. The League's Secretary General, Nabil El-Arabi of Egypt, said in March 2014 that Syria's seat would remain vacant until the opposition establishes its own institutions. But years have passed and the pro-democratic resistance in Syria has failed to topple Assad. Meanwhile, recent cautious diplomatic overtures by some Arab countries suggest that Syria could be welcomed back into the family of Arab states.
Almost each week brings a new political trial in Belarus. The dictatorship is trying to stamp out every sign of opposition. Not everyone is kept in a cage during their trial, though. Some have managed to flee the country before they could be detained. The trial of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is being conducted in absentia.
It has nothing to do with justice. It is just personal revenge against me and others who are opposing the regime. It will only make us fight even harder.
A regime prosecutor has also asked for a 19-year sentence for another significant opposition figure, Pavel Latushka. Latushka has recently decided to leave the Cooperation Council, a movement associated with Tikhanovskaya, over a difference of opinions.
The criminal case is being considered by the regime's court for activities in the Coordination Council and the Democratic Forces of Belarus. It motivates me to keep fighting.
According to Human Rights Center Vyazna, there are currently around 1,500 political prisoners in Belarus. The large-scale repressions in the country began after the presidential elections in 2020. The results of which are widely believed to be falsified. The United States, as well as the European Union and many other Western countries, did not recognize the outcome of the vote.
It's been a busy few weeks for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who has been working to secure a new post-Brexit trading agreement. Monday brought a decisive breakthrough in EU-UK negotiations following talks held with EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in Windsor earlier today. Finally, after news broke that the deal known as the Windsor Framework was struck, Prime Minister Sunak and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen confirmed the breakthrough at a press briefing held at Windsor Castle.
This agreement delivers smooth-flowing trade within the whole United Kingdom, protects Northern Ireland's place in our union, and safeguards sovereignty for the people of Northern Ireland.
This new framework will allow us to begin a new chapter. It provides for long-lasting solutions that both of us are confident will work for all people and businesses in Northern Ireland.
Questions immediately emerged about the agreement's impact on how trade is handled between Northern Ireland, the UK and the EU and how it will be taxed. Just a quick reminder, the Northern Ireland Protocol came into power in early 2021 and triggered legal action by the EU in response to alleged breaches of the protocol clauses. In February 2022, the Democratic Unionist Party pulled out of the Northern Ireland Assembly in protest. The DUP is yet to accept the deal which was negotiated by Prime Minister Sunak.
They've been opposed to the protocol. They've been grumbling in the background about the way Rishi Sunak's negotiated without consulting them very much. So they could still potentially be an obstacle to this. It's then a political decision by Rishi Sunak. Does he go ahead with the reform protocol irrespective of the DUP and, in a sense, call their bluff? Or does he wait until they agree, in which case he might be waiting forever?
Upon her visit, Mrs. von der Leyen met with King Charles at Windsor Castle, a reflection of a balancing act between a monarch who is politically neutral and maintaining an important constitutional role. It might take days before DUP and Tory backbenchers will be able to get through the legal documents, and we hear of any pushbacks. However, real test will be to get the DUP's approval of the new terms and conditions. Another important moment in the process of embracing the change will be the parliamentary vote on agreement. A significant hurdle that must be overcome before the deal becomes legally binding. From London for TVP World, Klaudia Czerwińska.
Hello, this is Eastern Europe Review, the common project of Belsat and TVP World, with reports and analysis from Ukraine, Belarus and Russia. I'm Alexandra Shapalina, and these are the main stories. Russian military commanders wanted to take over Bakhmut by the anniversary of the full-scale war, but they did not manage to do it.
We cover our infantry. That is, if the enemy starts activity, we hold them off. When we were in hotspots, we disrupted their attacks several times, and thus managed to keep our infantry alive.
Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is running a non-stop marathon to stand for democratic Belarus. The latest stop was at the Munich Security Conference.
The war, our regional war, can't end until Belarus becomes democratic. With Lukashenko's regime, with the influence that Putin has on him, there will be no peace and security in our region.
Celebrations in Russia against the backdrop of the war. People attending the events commemorated those who died in the war with Ukraine and glorified Vladimir Putin.
I want to say that once again our President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin has demonstrated to our entire country and the whole world that he is an ardent patriot and a great defender of our homeland.
The Russian army continues its offensive in the east of Ukraine, which has received widespread publicity. They have succeeded in advancing several kilometers in some areas, sacrificing hundreds of lives of their mobilized men in return. Traditionally, the most dangerous area is near Bakhmut. Russian military commanders wanted to present this small town in the Donetsk region to Putin on the anniversary of the full-scale war. However, they are still experiencing problems as Ukrainians are desperately fighting back. Our next story is right from the front line.
This is the southern flank of the Bakhmut bridgehead. Here, the Ukrainian troops are holding their defense by occupying dominant heights and peaks. The Russians are below and are occasionally attacking in small groups like now. This is how the Ukrainian mortarmen come into play.
We cover our infantry. That is, if the enemy starts activity, we hold them off. When we were in hotspots, we disrupted their attacks several times, and thus managed to keep our infantry alive.
The team works as smoothly as possible. They do everything to save time, and time is the most vital resource here. Mortar men are at their most vulnerable when they're firing. So when the next mortar is fired, there are soldiers on duty with other shells already prepared. It's like an assembly line.
15 kilograms. Wow, 15 kilograms is 15 kilograms. Why is it hard? It's not hard.
After each shot, the mortarmen adjust the sights. All the while, a drone hovers over enemy positions and improves the precision of the firing. Soon, the command arrives to intensify the shelling. The military activates another barrel. It could strike back here at any moment. The Ukrainian military understands this, but keeps firing back.
We had some pretty scary days when we were working under return fire, and there was a time when I almost got hit in the head by a shell. I could see the rear impeller of it spinning. It was a bit scary.
At some point, we go to a shelter. It is here, over hot tea, that the soldiers speak honestly about the situation.
We lead an active defense. We encounter the enemy quite seldom. They are not eager to get into our positions. We therefore have to seek them out and shoot them down.
The situation is more difficult in Bakhmut itself. With heavy losses, the Russians continue to try to push the Ukrainian army out of their positions. The fighting is intense. These are Ukrainian artillerymen near Bakhmut. While the infantry in the trenches is holding back another wave of Russian troops, howitzers are killing them en masse. But each new wave empties Ukrainian arsenals, so shells are also being counted here.
I wish we had NATO weapons and more ammunition, but we are managing with what we have. I take it you are using the ammunition very efficiently now? Yes, we are only working with UAVs or drone spotters so as not to blast randomly. We receive information on a target and what type of projectile we should shoot, and then we already understand what kind of target it is. Have you been shooting just now? Onto infantry. Just infantry. They are not protected from shrapnel.
On the anniversary of the start of the full-scale war, the Russian troops are desperately trying to capture Bakhmut. The Ukrainian defense forces are resisting the attack, and it does not seem that they are about to surrender the semi-enclosed town.
Belarusian Democratic leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is running a non-stop marathon. Another point was the Munich Security Conference. During the meetings with the most influential politicians and public figures, she defines the role of Belarus for security in the region, raises money for the victory of Belarusians over the dictatorship, and tries to convince Western leaders to keep the doors open for Belarusians. Details in our report from Munich.
Belarusian Democratic leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya attended the Munich Security Conference and joined the world's most influential politicians. This oldest and largest forum is attended by heads of state, ministers and journalists from all over the world. What message did Svetlana Tikhanovskaya bring to Munich?
The war, our original war, can't end until Belarus becomes democratic. With Lukashenko's regime, with the influence that Putin has on him, there will be no peace and security in our region.
The Belarusian Democratic leader has had about 30 discussions and meetings in 2 days. For example, she met with one of the most influential politicians in the U.S. Democrat Party, Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the U.S. Congress. The chairman of the European Commission and the former Minister of Defense of Germany, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Czech Republic, Petr Pavel, or the world-famous philanthropist, George Soros, whose foundation was expelled from Belarus by the Lukashenko regime back in 1997. The leitmotif of this year's conference was, of course, Russia's war against Ukraine. However, the Belarusian accent was also strong.
The Belarusian question can't be left for the day after the war, after the victory. We need to solve it now. As I said, the destinies of our countries are interconnected.
The connection between Russia's de facto occupation of Belarus and the war against Ukraine has been well understood in Munich. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya took part in several discussions. One of them was called, for example, Struggle for European Freedoms. What does the struggle of Ukraine and Belarus mean for our future? For the organizers, the Belarusian and Ukrainian struggles are parts of the same process.
The general message is not to forget about Belarus. Of course, I understand that the focus is now on Ukraine. We also support it, but not everyone realizes how Belarus can affect security in the region.
Svetlana Tikhanovskaya came to Munich, among other things, to talk with Western politicians about issues of Belarusians.
We also talk about the migration problems of Belarusians. This concerns not only Belarusians in the European Union, their legalization, apostille, how to obtain residency permits. This applies to the visa policy of the European Union countries, which issue visas to Belarusians who are still in the country.
In addition, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya asked foreign partners to host former Belarusian political prisoners.
How is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya perceived? Very warmly. This is not only because of the attitude towards Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as a person, although this is very important, but also out of respect for the struggle of the Belarusian people who haven't surrendered for 2.5 years and are demanding democratic changes.
The way Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is perceived can be helpful when she talks with politicians, businessmen, and public figures about Belarus. For example, when she discusses coordinated strategy in defense of Belarusian independence with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, or when she talks about the increased participation of Belarus in the projects of the Council of Europe with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iceland, Þórdís Kolbrún, who currently chairs the Council of Europe. It can also help to convey that Belarus plays a key role as far as security issues in Eastern Europe are concerned.
This week, Russians celebrated Defender of the Fatherland Day. In Russia, for the first time in modern history, this date was celebrated on a grand scale. For the first time, the regional authorities were obliged to organize concerts and rallies with the aim of convincing people of the need to protect the country from enemies.
Patriotic songs could be heard in the main squares of hundreds of Russian cities as early as February the 22nd, when a 4-day holiday officially started. The bank holiday, which is called Defender of the Fatherland Day, is celebrated on the 23rd. During these holidays, Russians usually relax and have fun. But before the holidays, many people who work in the civil service, students and pensioners were forced to participate in the official events. In the large Siberian coal mining region of Kuzbass, the authorities organized a concert and forced people to attend the event. People were holding Russian flags, symbols of Vladimir Putin's party, and cards with the letter Z, which Russians consider to be a symbol of the war in Ukraine.
I want to say that once again our President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin has demonstrated to our entire country and the whole world that he is an ardent patriot and a great defender of our homeland.
It takes more than 4 hours by plane to travel from Moscow to the Kemerovo region. The day before, its governor returned back after attending Vladimir Putin's speech to the Federal Assembly. Government explained to the heads of the regions the nuances of propaganda and agitation in the Russian capital. They should tell people that the country is now in danger. The enemies are those who don't support Russia in the war against Ukraine. But it is not necessary to say exactly who it is. Putin himself took the stage at a patriotic concert in Moscow. Similar events were also held in other regions. But even those who had been prepared to speak to journalists couldn't give a coherent speech without hesitating.
We must unite. Unity is extremely important to end this terrible pressure that our people, the Russian world, are experiencing today from the West and NATO. It's very important that each person can contribute his own. I'm not saying that again.
Saratov is based in the southeast European part of Russia. Most of those who came to the square were students. They say they wanted to come by themselves, but their lecturers let slip that the rally distribution list was issued by the university's chancellor's office.
We had a question about whether to take first-year students, still not 18 years old. You know, they expressed their wish and said they just have to take part.
This is a phenomenon. For the first time since 1991, the celebrations of the Defender of the Fatherland Day, which is officially celebrated in Russia on February the 23rd and declared a day off, began earlier. Russians have witnessed a series of transformation of the meaning of the holiday. After the collapse of the USSR in modern Russian history, February the 23rd was actually celebrated as Men's Day. Now it has been filled with militaristic meaning, and in fact it has been put on the same level as Victory Day on May the 9th.
I'm proud of the fact that all of Russia has rallied. We all support this operation. We are worried about the guys who are at the front. I hope it will be over soon and Russia will win, so that no one threatens our country.
However, other opinions are heard outside of the pro-government rallies. Here's what people say in the streets of St. Petersburg.
It is difficult to talk about any victory, because entry into the war was a political defeat in itself. We see, accordingly, a slightly different Russia. We travel a lot and see. We have a lot of things to do in Russia. We need to restore Russia. Factories have been closed. People graduate from colleges, get a free diploma, and work as waiters, because they can get some tips there and so on.
In Russia, even school children are now instilled with patriotism and support for the war. In the Far East, in the Jewish Autonomous Region, the authorities instructed teachers to hold thematic events, and so the children draw the military and pack the parcels to the front, just to make sure no one doubts about the role of the Russian army in the full-scale war against Ukraine. In several districts of Buryatia, in the north of the country, all festive events were cancelled due to a series of funerals of those killed in Ukraine.
That's all for today. Thank you for watching Eastern Europe Review. We will be back next week with the news stories. I'm Alexandra Shapalina. Keep watching TVP World and see you next time.
Coffins laid out near the beach on the coast of Italy serve as a grim symbol of the ongoing migrant crisis. Italian authorities discovered yet another body following a migrant shipwreck on Sunday. Authorities believe 180 to 200 people were on board the ship, carrying migrants from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Syria.
They are aware not only that they are risking their lives, but that they are embarking with traffickers. They arrive with their life savings to make the crossing.
Italy is located along the popular Central Mediterranean migratory route, which is one of the most used paths to Europe. The country serves as a gateway into the European Union, but has ramped up efforts to decrease the amount of irregular migration into the country. Unfortunately, this makes little to no difference.
We keep hearing, I would rather die at sea than go back to Libya. So rules like this will never stop people from making that crossing. People on the run will not stop trying to find safety.
This migratory route has seen a record 100,000 crossings in the past year, but also over 20,000 deaths and disappearances since 2016. The Central Mediterranean route has been dubbed as the most dangerous crossing in the world.
Dozens of deaths, including children. The Five-Star Movement has been asking for years a management of migration flows shared with Europe. Continuing to wait is proving inhumane.
Italy is one of the so-called countries of first entry.